sa akong work. Wala naman ko nila dawaton. Kay ingon sila na dugay naman ako nag-work na. So
Nanas pa, Sir
ingon
Tim.
sila, apply ka dito sa Pikas. So apply ko sa Pikas, naa may bayad. Nga. Sorry.
That's all right. I apologize, man. My internet went out.
Yeah.
Or else somebody didn't like me, so they just cut me off. I'm sorry about that. What I was noting was the sort of the structure here of Ephesians and how it seems to be somewhat of a chiasm. All right, and where doxology begins and ends a section, and then prayers inside. This is unique to Paul's epistles, and I think it expresses again a sort of poetic influence on Paul's writings in Ephesians. Okay, so that was just more of a side rabbit trail, but I think I find it very interesting. So there's a couple things to take note of. Any questions on that or comments?
No.
Pastor Tim, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Can you, what's a chiasm again? If you can remind me.
Sure. A chiasm would be, we looked at it when we talked about parallelism.
Yes.
And it's basically where you have a line or a verse that, let me show you
okay. I remember.
Yeah.
A,
So
and then BA.
Yeah, I'll take an example from Psalm 51. Oh, of course it's going to be, let me increase the font here. All right, notice here, be gracious to me, O God. And then the second line is, according to your loving kindness.
Mm-hmm.
And then notice the beginning of the next line says, according to your greatness of your compassion, blot out my transgressions. So the idea is this line is sort of the same ideas expressed in a different way in that line. And then the middle two lines are connected together because they are in the reverse order. Or the second line, he flips the order. So it's this line A, the beginning and the end is similar, and then the two middle lines are similar. And so sometimes you'll see authors that'll actually form this kind of structure within a larger section where they might have, and like I was showing with Paul, where the first section is this topic, and the last part of the section is the same topic. So for example, in Paul, the beginning of, this is chapters 1 to 3. I'll call it a major section, focused on God's work in Christ in our salvation. All right, and that section starts with a doxology in the first 12 verses, and then the section ends in a doxology. And then the second part of that major section is a prayer. The second to the last part of that major section is a prayer. So you see there's a symmetry.
Yes.
Here. Okay? So that's really a poetic element that normally we see in chiasms, where one line is reversed after a second line's reversed compared to the first. Okay, let me go back to this refrain here. So a refrain, again, think of it like a chorus. And for example, in Ephesians 1, we saw an example of that, a refrain. In Psalm 42, we see this refrain. And what's also interesting is in the very next psalm, Psalm 43, we see the same statement, but it's in another psalm. It's in the psalm right after Psalm 42, but it's the exact same if you compare, right? If you look at this, let me stick them next to each other. Why are you in despair, O my soul? Why are you disturbed within me? You see that? The same exact statement. Hope in God, for I shall again praise him. Same exact statement. The help of my countenance and my God. So this has led many scholars, and I think probably they are correct, to say that Psalm 42 and 43 may have originally been one psalm. That somehow in the course of the compiling of the Psalms may have accidentally been separated. And so if you're ever studying Psalm 42 or Psalm 43, you need to keep that in mind, that very possibly the Psalm 43 could have been originally part of the first Psalm 42. Okay? And as you study both of these Psalms together more, that really makes a lot of sense. But one of the ways that we see it potentially is this unique refrain. Okay? So here's an example where a refrain actually opens up an interesting thought where we have two Psalms that may actually have originally been one. This is, I think, one of the only cases in the whole book of Psalms where we have this take place. Some have argued Psalm 9 and Psalm 10 may have originally been one psalm, but I'm not as convinced. But Psalm 42 and 43, I think there's a strong case for that. So when you preach through this Psalm 42, I would suggest you do it together with Psalm 43, because Psalm 42 also doesn't really answer the question, but Psalm 43 does. So they really seem to be fit together. Okay, that's a freebie, but refrain is what the focus is. That repeated line that functions like a chorus that takes place at the end of a stanza. All right, any questions on that? I think I beat that concept to death. So let's get to the next one. The next one. All right, and this is repetition. We've already seen this. We already talked about it, but repetition, right, is the repeated use of a word or phrase or a synonym within a verse or within the poem. Now, so for example, what's the repeated word or phrase in this psalm?
How long?
How long?
How long? Okay.
How long?
Also notice the poetic device being used here of a rhetorical question, right? But how long, how long, how long, how long? 4 times he repeats it. Now, is this a refrain? Is this a chorus?
No.
No. For one, it's not the same phrase being repeated. It's not the whole line being repeated. It's that word, those 2 words, how long, which actually is 1 word in Hebrew. That's 2 words actually, adna. But it's how long, how long, how long. So it's repetition here. It's not a refrain. It's not a chorus being repeated. It's not inclusio, because it's not a line or a couple lines being repeated. It's just a short 2 words as part of this question that's being repeated. And what's the effect of this repetition in this particular psalm? How does it affect the reader? What do you guys think?
Desperation.
Yeah, it emphasizes his emotion, right? His desperation. How long, how long, how long, how long? I mean, it's kind of this just exclamation of despair, and we see that in the repetition. And that's often what repetition does, is repetition often communicates emotion, emphasis, focus on a particular thought or theme or feeling. Okay? And we do that, don't we? When we preach, we utilize repetition. We want Also can be helpful, just helpful to remember, right? If we repeat as well. So repetition, as I said, is it's probably the most common device used in poetry, I would say. It's used in a lot of genres, but poetry in particular. So be on the lookout for that, for repetition. And we already saw that in Psalm 99, just even within the verses. Okay, any questions on repetition? Hopefully that's fairly straightforward. We're okay?
Yes.
All right. Edwin, you're still with us? Everything's good?
We're awake and alive.
Okay. Very good. All right. Let's go to the next poetic device. This one is, in the past, I used the term elision. I think a more accurate term that we need to use is ellipsis. Okay, ellipsis. That is the omission of a word or phrase, but is still assumed to be there. So for example, let me give an example, then I'll come back and explain it. May the Lord cut off all flattering lips, the tongue that speaks great things. Now, is that second line, are we missing something here?
May the Lord.
Yeah, the assumption is, right, may the Lord cut off the tongue that speaks great things, right? Otherwise, if you take that out, and as the verse stands alone, that second line doesn't make any sense. It's not complete, is it? May the Lord cut off all flattering lips. Okay, that's a contained sentence. It makes sense. There's a subject, verb, object. But the second line, if we look at it by itself, the tongue that speaks great things. Well, what about the tongue? What's he saying here? It's an incomplete thought unless we understand and recognize that he used ellipsis here. He did not include this statement, may the Lord cut off, but it's assumed to be there. Okay? So ellipsis means that he omitted that phrase in the second line. But it's still there. The concept is still there. And this is done, ellipsis is often used just for the artistic quality, because if you're repeating the same thing over and over, it sort of loses its aesthetic value. It's not as poetic unless the author's intending to do that for repetition, because he's trying to emphasize a point. But often you'll see this ellipsis take place where the author will take out a word or a few words or a phrase just in order for it to flow more poetically. Okay? We saw that in parallelism, if you'll remember, where sometimes a word or a few words were not written in the second line, but were presumed to be there. Now, elision, let me just explain. Ellipsis is focused just on the omission of a word or phrase. Elision is the more general concept used in music or other things where you can eliminate a sound or even a syllable. So they're similar in effect. So if you say elision or ellipsis, it's okay, but ellipsis actually is technically the more correct term because that focuses solely on the omission of a word or a phrase. Elision is broader. It can include omitting a musical note or a sound or something else in a broader sense. Okay, so ellipsis. You can think of an ellipse, an eclipse, I mean, right, where the moon is blocked or the sun is blocked. An ellipsis is sort of the idea of certain words are blocked out, that you don't see them there, but you know they are. Okay? That makes sense. So it's not an eclipse, but it sounds like one. It's ellipsis, all right? But like an eclipse. All right. Any questions so far? Okay. Last one, and then we'll get to some examples. All right. The last one is our friend Salah. All right. In Psalm 4, we see that there, the Salah repeated 2 places there. And if you guys, who can tell me what Salah means? That's not an English word, right?
Pause and meditate.
Yes, it's a Hebrew word, and no one's exactly sure the particular meaning, but what is believed to be the case is that it has this idea of a pause for reflection, either a pause in music, if there were instruments being played, or a pause in the reciting of the poem. So
or ending of stanza.
Say again?
Ending of stanza.
Sometimes it can be the ending of a stanza. Don't assume that, but that is one possibility. There are a few examples of that. More often than not, it will not. It does not end a stanza, but sometimes it does. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Don't assume it ends a stanza, but it does at times. I think its more common use is for that pause. So, for example, when you see Salah as you're reading a psalm, a couple things. One, don't read the word Salah. It's not meant to be read. All right, it's kind of like in parentheses. It's like the author saying, it's like if I had written, let's say, for example, I wrote something, roses are red and violets are blue. Pause.
Breathe before you read the next. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Pause
Like
for a minute.
Like an instruction.
My heart is overwhelmed by love for you. Okay. So let's say you're reading this to your wife, right? And you ask me, hey, Pastor Tim, can you give me a little poem I can read for my wife? I'm not very good at poetry, so I want to. It's our anniversary, so can you write up a little poem for me? So I say, yeah, sure. So I send this to you by email. Roses are red, violets are blue, and then I want to give you an instruction for dramatic effect to pause between these 2 lines. So I'll write in here. I'll say to you, pause for a minute. That's instruction for you as you're reading it. But that doesn't mean you should read it. Roses are red and violets are blue. Pause for a minute. My heart is overwhelmed by love for you. All right? That doesn't work, does it? So Salah is like that. It's written there by the author intending for the person reading the poem or the people singing the poem to sort of pause and reflect. So don't read it as you're going through the poem, but this is what you would do. So as you're reading the passage, say, in your sermon or whatever, "O sons of men, how long will my honor become a reproach? How long will you love what is worthless and aim at deception? But know that the Lord has set apart the godly man for himself. The Lord hears when I call to him." Do you see that? I just sort of pause for a moment, but I don't read Salah, and you don't make a big dramatic thing about it. It just sort of a slow down, wait here for a second. Okay? Again, it's instruction. Look at it that way. And if there was often instruction given to people playing instruments for some of these psalms, and so that would be an instruction for them to pause in their playing for a moment so that people can reflect. All right? Because when somebody stops as they're reading or speaking and they just stop and pause, right? You're kind of like, wait, what's going on? Oh, you know, it sort of gets your attention a little bit, doesn't it? Especially for some of you who just, when you preach, you just keep going, you know, and you don't stop. So when you pause, it gets people's attention. So think of Salah like that. It's intended to slow us down, to be reflective. So if you see a psalm that has a lot of Salahs in it, what does that tell you about what the author wants? What's his intended tone for the psalm? Right, he wants a lot of reflection, doesn't he? He wants you to be thinking about what's there. If you'll notice, a number of psalms don't have any Salah. Okay, you just read through the psalm, but when you do have those psalms that have that, take note of that. And again, don't your first response should not be, this is a stanza break. All right, your first response is that primarily Salahs are there for pausing, but sometimes that pause is at the end of a stanza, so the Salah will be there. I'll show you an example of that when we move forward. Okay. All right. So we looked at these five devices: inclusio, refrain, repetition, and
Ellipsis.
ellipsis. Good. And Salah. Okay. So those are the ones. So what I want to do now is, like last time when we did for figures of speech, I'm going to give you a passage. I'm going to choose someone to read that passage. And then I want you to tell me which of these devices here, inclusio, refrain, repetition, ellipsis, or Salah, which of those devices do you see in that passage that I give you, okay? So we'll start with Macdon. I'm going to have you read Psalm 24, verse 1, and then tell me what you see from those five poetic devices that we just talked about: repetition, refrain, inclusio, ellipsis, or Salah. Okay, go ahead, brother. Oh, you need to unmute yourself. There you
The
go.
earth is the Lord's, and all it contains, the world and those who dwell in it.
I heard somebody say it. What do you think, Macdon?
I think it's
Repetition.
Ellipsis.
Okay, I hear ellipsis, I hear repetition.
edition.
Okay, if it's ellipsis, where would the ellipsis be? Meaning, what has been removed or omitted?
The earth is the Lord's.
Okay, we've got the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. The world, and what's assumed to be here?
It's the Lord's.
It's the Lord's.
It's the
See that?
Yes.
So is the Lord's is omitted from second line. Now I heard repetition. Where do we see repetition?
The earth and the world.
Yeah, earth and the world. And that would make sense because of the synonymous parallelism, right?
Yes, synonymous, contains and dwell.
Yeah. Yeah, contains, also contains. All right, good. Okay. Very good. Eric, we'll just have you do the next one. This one's a little bit longer. It's from the same psalm, Psalm 24. Now, again, I just want you to focus on the additional poetic devices we've looked at. Don't worry about all the figures of speech here, but only consider the repetition, refrain, inclusio, ellipsis, or Salah. So go ahead and read it and then tell me what you see.
Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and lift them up, O ancient doors. The King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. There's an inclusio.
Okay. Where do you
There's
see
a,
that?
there are so many things, Pastor Tim.
Okay, well, now you have inclusio here. Where do you see an inclusio?
Lift up your heads, and here, verse 9 and verse 7. Verse
Okay. Verse 7 and verse 9. Now, it could be a refrain as well, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, refrain.
Yes, refrain.
So we'd have to, I think it's refrain given the position here, or repetition. All right. So this we'd have to know the psalm a little better to determine. If we know the structure of the psalm better, I think we would realize it's just probably an evidence of a refrain. Okay. But inclusio is a possibility until we know more about the psalm. All right. What else do you see?
Sila.
Selah. Yeah, they're at the end of verse 10. There's more verses
Repetition.
afterwards. What's that?
Repetition.
Yeah, where's the repetition?
King of
Lift
glory.
up your heads. Lift up your heads.
King of
Lord
glory.
and mighty.
The
Okay,
King of
so
glory,
lift
the Lord
up your heads. That's in what verses?
Okay.
7 and
7
9.
and 9.
Who is the King of glory?
Lifted up,
Yeah, King of glory.
King of glory.
Right.
The Lord
That's
mighty.
repeated a lot, right?
Yes.
Verse
Yeah,
7,
that's
8, 9, 10, and then 10 again. Now that's quite
The
emphatic.
Lord.
Repetition. We also have doors, gates.
The Lord.
Yes.
Yeah, and then the
Doors,
Lord.
gate. The Lord.
Repetition. Yahweh, really, right? Notice it's capital letters.
Mighty.
And that's in verse 8, verse 8, 8, 8, and again in 10. Yeah, mighty. A lot of repetition here, isn't there? You're right, Eric. There's so much.
there are so many and so much.
And that's mighty in verse 8, actually. He mentions it twice. All right, good. Now, let me ask you a couple questions. Is this question here, if we're thinking about, the other poetic devices, is this a rhetorical question? Who is the King of glory?
Yes.
Yes.
It can be, but in this case, he's not using it as a rhetorical question. Because notice, he gives an answer. Okay? So it's rhetorical in one sense that we know the answer. But here in the psalm, he gives us the answer, so he's not intending it to be like a rhetorical question. Just because we do have the answer. So that's one thing to consider. Another thing is there's another poetic device that's used a lot here that we learned before. Remember I told you about the O? Look at O gates. O ancient doors. O gates. O ancient doors. What's that called again, men?
Apostrophe.
There you go. Remember?
Apostrophe.
Apostrophe. With the O there.
Apostrophe.
O gates. O ancient doors. All right. Just wanted to just make sure to take note of that. Okay, good. But we see in refrain here, Salah, lots of repetition going on in this example. All right. Brother Ramel, I'm going to have you do this one. Psalm 36, verse 10. Just tell us what you see here as far as the one of those 5 devices we've been looking at. Go ahead and unmute yourself there too.
Oh, continue your loving kindness to those who know you, and your righteousness to the upright. Oh, continue
What do you see?
you and your righteousness.
And just to remind you, we're looking at either refrain, inclusio, repetition, Selah, or ellipsis.
Ellipsis.
Okay, do you guys see the ellipsis there?
Yes.
What was omitted?
Oh, continue.
Yeah, oh, continue. Not in the second line, right? It's implied that all right, so that's one thing. Do we see anything else? I think that's the main thing I see. Brother Ramel, do you see anything else?
No.
Okay. Yeah, this was pretty straightforward. All right, getting some interference here. Okay. Let's look at the next one, and we'll have, this one's a little bit longer. In fact, I included the whole psalm here. So let's see. Brother Narelle, we'll have you do this one. This is Psalm 8. Can you see all of it there?
Inclusion.
All right.
Okay.
What do you see there?
Inclusio.
Yeah, where is the inclusio?
O Lord, our Lord.
Yeah,
Verse 1 and verse 9.
good. Yeah, we talked about this psalm a little bit earlier, but that's good. Because notice there's a title here, and then he starts the psalm. He has an inclusio here after the title, just to focus attention on the poem itself. All right, so he begins it and ends it with the same thing, giving us an idea of the main focus of the poem, and that he's bracketing everything within it. This is pretty common for inclusio. It's usually used of the entire poem. Okay. There's some repetition in here, but we won't go through it too much. Notice the repetition here: sheep, oxen, and beasts. That's an example. Birds of the heavens. They're not the same word, but they're the same group. So I would put that under repetition. Okay. All right.
Moon, stars.
Yeah, and there's another group. Moon and stars. Okay, heavens. That's all part of the same. Okay. And then that psalm had a number of figures of speech, but we're not going to. All right. Another example. This will be the last one before we look at Psalm 99. Okay, and I even highlighted it here for us. Notice in this psalm, we have a repeated statement at the end of these stanzas. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. What's that called?
Refrain.
It's a refrain.
And Selah.
Okay, and then also, yes, we see a Selah. Now in this case, as Eric I think mentioned earlier, here the Selah is at the end of each stanza. Okay, so this is an example. of that. So we have both a refrain and a salah. And so that indicates these are distinct stanzas. And we know that this is not an inclusio here because of the structure of this poem, that verses 1 to 3 is one stanza, verses 4 to 7 is the second one, and verses 8 to 11. So this is, the highlighted portion is a refrain. It's a chorus in this psalm. Okay? All right. Very good. Well, let's get to Psalm 99 and see if we can find these poetic devices within that psalm. All right? So I'm going to ask Brother Jess if you could read verses 1 through 3. Brother Salito, if you could read 4 through 6. And then Edwin, if you could read 7 through 9. Okay? And then we'll do is we'll read through it, and then we'll see if we can identify the any of these 5 poetic devices within Psalm 99. Okay, Jesse, 1 through 3, please. Sorry, brother, you're muted.
Muted ka, bro.
You're still muted. There you go.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Psalm 99 verses 1 to 3. The Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. He is enthroned above the cherubim, let the earth shake. The Lord is great in Zion, and is exalted above all peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he.
Okay. Brother Salito, verses 4 to 6. You're muted too, brother. Can you unmute? Thank you.
Okay. The strength of the kings loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his footstool. Holy is he. Moses and Aaron were among his priests, and Samuel was among those who called on his name. They called upon the Lord, and he answered them.
Okay, very good. Brother Edwin, can you read verses 7 through 9?
Verse 7. He spoke to them in the pillar of cloud. They kept his testimonies, the statute that he gave them. O Lord, our God, you answered them. You were a forgiving God to them, and yet a avenger of their evil deeds. Exalt the Lord our God and worship at his holy hill, for holy is the Lord our God.
Okay, good. Let's see how we can do this. It's too small to. Let me do it this way. Okay, do we see any repetition in the psalm overall?
Yes,
What kind of repetition do we see here?
the Lord.
Yes, we see the Lord, or again, this is,
1, verse 2.
remember, when you see capital letters, capital O-R-D, what does that tell you? That's
Yahweh.
Yahweh, okay? If you see Lord lowercase letters here, that actually is the
Yes.
idea of master. It comes from the Hebrew word Adonai.
Adonai.
Okay? So here we see, notice Lord is repeated Yahweh here. Verse 1, verse 3, verse 5,
Verse 5.
Verse 6.
verse 6,
Verse 8.
8.
Verse 9. Verse 9 twice.
Okay? So almost every verse we see Yahweh, and then we also see, notice, our God in several of them at the end, don't we? See that? Yahweh our God.
Yes.
I'll just add it in green. Yahweh our God. Yahweh our God, verse 8. Do we see that anywhere else? Yahweh our God, verse 5. I think that's it. Okay. Now you might say, well, of course, you know, the Bible's got God's name everywhere in it. But if you look at many other Psalms, you may not see Yahweh repeated that often, or you might see the other term Lord, Adonai. But here there seems to be an emphasis in most every verse, Yahweh and then Yahweh our God as well. Now, why does that make sense given the theme of this poem? What's the focus of this poem? Remember? What's this?
holiness.
God's
The
holiness.
Holiness.
And we're being called to respond in some way, correct?
Yes, worship.
Worship, right? Remember we said, and exalt.
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 Right?
Praise.
The Lord is great. He's exalted. Let them praise. Holy is he.
Worship.
Exalt the Lord. Worship at his footstool. Exalt the Lord. Worship at his holy hill. Holy is the Lord. So it makes sense that this repetition of Yahweh our God, Yahweh, Yahweh our God, Yahweh our God, there's this focus on worship, right? Calling out to him. So that would make sense to see that repetition. Anything else that you see repeated here in the psalm? I just mentioned something.
The Lord is great and you're great.
Okay.
Verse 3.
Great. And we could say exalted is a similar idea, right?
Yes.
Enthroned.
Throne.
Even maybe reigns is a again, it doesn't have to be the exact same word,
It's a synonym.
but same idea. Yeah, synonyms. All right, do we see great or exalted
How about
anywhere
holy?
else?
How about Pastor Tim, verse 3? You're great. Is Lord great?
Ah, good. I missed it. Great and awesome.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good.
Oops.
Any other things repeated in this
Verse
song?
4,
Excuse me?
verse 4, repetition, is it justice, equity, righteousness?
Very good. Very good. So let's see if I can find another color for that. We'll do this one. Justice, equity, justice repeated here, righteousness. All right. Let's see if we see that anywhere else. I don't think we will, but having it repeated 4 times in one verse, there's some emphasis in that verse there. Okay, good.
Word answered them. The word answered them.
Answered, we see repeated in verse 6. Ah, good, in verse 8. So here, let me see if I can find another color. I'll do this one. Answered, answered.
Yes.
It's only repeated twice, but we see it in 2. And we might even say, even though it's kind of a different concept, but it's connected, right? Called. So they called, he answered. So they're linked together in that way.
Statutes and testimonies.
Yeah, those would go together. I'm just going to do how about that? Whoops, that was the wrong thing. Okay, and there's one other one that I see here.
The phrase
is, notice exalt, praise,
Exalt, praise.
where to exalt, verse 5.
Praise, verse 3.
Yeah, we got praise in verse 3. We've got
Worship,
exalt again
verse
in verse
5.
verse 9, worship.
And then, yeah, we could almost put worship.
Bring the coffee to you.
Okay. All right. So those are some examples of repetition. So I'll just put C above. All right. And how about refrain? Do we see a refrain in here? That is sort of a repeated phrase. Pardon?
Verse 5 and 9.
5
Holy
and
is
9,
he.
Pastor Ken. Yeah,
What's
Verse 5 and 9.
the refrain?
holy is he.
Yes.
Yes, verse
Holy is
5
he,
and
for
9.
holy is the Lord our God.
Holy is
Exalt the
he,
Lord
or
our God.
holy is Yahweh. Okay, yeah, and
Holy
that's
is the Lord.
verses 3, 5, and 9, correct? Okay, good. And then even verses 5 to 9 has more. Exalt the Lord our God, worship at his footstool, holy is he. So 5 and 9 are even more, have several lines. Okay? Now, ellipsis.
Pastor Tim,
Yes.
5 and 9 cannot be considered as inclusio.
No, because again, we've looked at this psalm and its structure, right? And you remember verses, the stanzas. We figured out where verses 1 and 3, verses 4 to 5, and verses 6 to 9. Remember, we figured that out because we saw this repeated "Holy is He." We saw a change in the focus. The first 3 verses focus on the world, and then there's a shift in verses 4 and 5 to God's people, and then so we had that whole discussion earlier about the structure. So 3, 5, and 9 appear to be at the end of each of those stanzas. So we know it's not an inclusio, and there's no state beginning in verse 1 that's being repeated. Okay. So 3, 5, and 9 are sort of a refrain. Holy is he, holy is he, holy is the Lord our God. And again, with inclusio, we usually would only have it twice, but here that's 3 times. It's repeated. So I think it's, so from the stanzas, so not inclusio, based on the stanzas, and then also repeated 3 times. Inclusio would be twice. Okay? Jesse, does that make sense?
Thank you, Pastor Tim. Thank you, Pastor Tim.
Okay. All right. Now, ellipsis, I think it would be harder for us to go through all of these to find it, but one example that I found was
Verse
here.
7, ellipsis.
Yeah. What's omitted here in verse 7?
Verse 7, they kept his testimony and they kept the statutes that he gave them.
Yeah, they kept is left out of that line. Okay? That's the only one that I caught going through here. And then finally, again, we don't have any inclusio here. Ellipsis, we had verse 7. There's no inclusio. And then did you guys see any salahs in this poem? Any salah? No. So again, this psalm, there's no intention for you to pause anywhere. You just to go through the 9 verses, the entire poem in one saying. All right. Okay. Any questions on that? Had enough of poetic devices, right? Let's move on. So again, we want to keep in mind what's the effect of all of these poetic devices? I mean, well, again, with repetition, right? That conveys emphasis, emotion.
Theme.
Yes, sir. Theme. Good.
A theme. Yes.
Theme. Okay. The refrain, it focuses attention on the key point, right? Which is what in this psalm? Holy is he. I mean, those are in this psalm. And refrain again is refrain is a form of repetition, isn't it? It's a repeated phrase with, or line or lines with the intent of functioning like a chorus, but it is a repetition. And so all of these things, this repetition really focuses on this idea of God's holiness and our call to exalt and worship him. All right, that's the main idea. All right, and these poetic devices simply reinforce that. Okay?
Pastor Tim,
Yes.
is it the repetition is what, and the refrain is the why? What, why, how? What, why, how?
Well, in this case, so you're saying that repetition. Well, I would agree the refrain is the why.
Or the how.
Of the psalm. The how of the psalm are the stanzas. Okay, remember the how is the outline?
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
yes. In this case, a poem, its outline are the stanzas. In a story, the outline is the scenes. In an epistle, the outline comes from the structural diagram. In a poem, the outline comes from the stanzas. So here we'll have three points because the psalm has 3 stanzas. Okay? And in this case, the refrain really does focus on the why. The what is the idea, right, of exalt, worship. The why is because he is holy. And then the how are those 3 stanzas.
Stanza.
So we've jumped ahead a little bit, but can you see how what we've learned so far really helps us to see already, I think, the what, why, and the how. Okay? Now, last but not least is, okay, if we look at our figure here, so I can pull it up. All right. We've really focused our attention the last several weeks on this step. And in that step are these 5 elements, is to read and observe, identify the setting, examine the parallelism, the imagery poetic devices, and then we want to summarize the theme of the poem and each stanza. All right? So as we consider this poem, we almost were just talking about that, right? What is the theme of, so step 5 of poetic analysis is to summarize from what we studied so far, summarize the theme of the poem and each stanza. Okay? So from the theme of the poem, what would we say that is at this point? Yeah, it's the holiness of God and our call to exalt and worship him.
Or our response.
Yeah, our response. Good.
To God's holiness.
So something to the effect of exalt God because he is holy. Something like that. You guys see that? Now, the 3 stanzas, nothing has shown us that's any different. As I mentioned already, verses 1 to 3, verses 4 to 5, and verses 6 through 9. That's going to take a little more thought as we look at it. Verses 1 through 3, and we looked at this before a little bit. What do we see here sort of the focus of these first three verses? Just the repetition, what does it tell us?
The Lord is great.
Reigns, enthroned, great, exalted, great,
Praise.
awesome. And remember we saw early on the statements and then the command. You remember that?
The inductive,
The indicative case,
indicative,
verse 1 and 2, it's telling us
the-
something about
yes.
Yahweh. And then verse 3, how do you respond?
Inductive.
So notice the focus here in the first stanza.
The rain.
Right, the focus is the greatness of God, the greatness or exaltedness, I could say. And then the command
The worship. The praise.
is to praise Him. So we might say something like, praise God.
For His great. For His great.
name.
He is great. Praise our
God for
holy
His
God,
great.
right? Because we have that idea of holiness. All right, something like that. And again, we're going to refine this later, but at this step, I just want you, after you've done all of this analysis, poetic analysis, is to come back and then say, well, let me see how I would summarize each of these stanzas. All right, now the second stanza. What do we see here? The repetition is on. You see that?
The justice.
What is the indicative here? What is being said about God? God is just.
Judge.
Right?
Just.
And then
Equity.
what's the command?
Equitable and righteous.
Exalt the Lord.
Exalt the Lord.
So here we would say exalt Yahweh, or you could say worship. Worship, exalt our holy Yahweh, for He is just. Something like that.
Just.
See that?
And righteous.
Okay. Now, yeah, there are synonyms there, but the idea is just God is a just God. You know, that's the focus. Now, this last stanza, verses 6 through 9, again, we have the same command. See it there? The exact same. Exalt Yahweh for His what? Now, in this case, what is the indicative? What's being said about God here?
He's with us.
For He is answered.
Yeah, notice the repetition. Do you see how the repetition's helping us here? We called, He answered. He answered. All right? He spoke to them. We didn't note that, but that's also repeated idea, like the idea of answer. So the indicative is God.
Yeah.
God's kindness to answer prayer, something like that. So we might say the summary is exalt our holy Yahweh for now we could just say answered prayer or something like that. Or for His mercy. His mercy or His graciousness, yeah. Kindness, those would be idea. Okay? So that's all we're doing here. We're not making our sermon yet. We're just kind of like, let's step back and
outline.
Step back and see, you know, put our outline together, and we'll refine it later and after we do a few more steps. But what I like to do is after I do the poetic analysis, I like to just take a moment and then see if I can, you know, okay, what seems to be at this point the overall theme of this psalm, and clearly it's an emphasis on exalt, praise, exalt, worship. So worship our holy God, you know, worship God because of His holiness, and then in each stanza, it seems to focus on a different attribute of God. The first stanza is like on His greatness, His exaltedness. The second stanza focuses on his
Justice.
justice, and then the third stanza is something related to his mercy, his kindness, his grace. All right? But each one of these stanzas has this idea of holiness as well. Okay? And that's where we can, you know, stop there and just, we don't have to try to perfect the outline or anything like that. We're just sort of forming it as we go. Okay? Because now what we'll do is the next step, as I showed you in the figure here, our next step is we're going to go to our structural diagram. So we're going to go back and dissect and examine this poem from a different direction. We're not going to look at it from a poetic standpoint, but now we're going to go back and look at the grammar and how the verses are related together. But we'll save that for the next time that we meet. We'll review diagramming a little bit, and then I will show you how we can use diagramming, structural diagramming, in looking at a poem. Okay? It's similar to an epistle, but there are a few things to consider. All right, any final questions or comments? Now you are Hebrew poetry experts. Okay? So if anyone asks me questions, you know, I will just refer them to you guys. I say, oh, I have some experts. My brothers in the Philippines, they are Hebrew poetry experts now. So, did I show you? I showed you Dr. Barrick's website, didn't I?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Last time around.
All right, good. Now,
Useful.
Yes, Seti.
yeah, I think it's been very helpful for me. So I wanted to make sure I showed you that. Any other final questions or comments?
This is one of the reason why we should thank God for COVID-19.
That we can have this time together. Yeah.
Yeah. This is
Yeah.
a great help.
Once things opened up, I think it will be harder for us to do this, but we'll see. I'm definitely praying for you brothers, just for God's protection, and I'm, you know, very much aware. And whenever I see stories in our news anyway about the Philippines, I want to read, but I know not everything they say here is accurate, so that's why I ask you brothers. Just a note.
Pastor Tim.
Yes, sir.
Pastor Tim, can we do like this in our narrative class or narrative course?
Yes, I'm doing it actually with the brothers in Cagayan because they're on the narrative module. So I've been going through a narrative with them. We could do a narrative together next if we want to continue.
After this.
Sure.
One-on-one.
Yeah, I would be happy to do that. And my plan is, brothers, after, you know, when we do come together and we're able to look at prophecy, we'll do a module on prophecy. And my plan is after that module, maybe I'll wait a few weeks. And then my plan is to do something like this with a prophetic passage and just walk through it.
Yes.
Each week. So I think, yeah, one blessing out of all of this, the virus issues, is at least it's allowed opportunity to try this out. And if it's a help to you guys, I would love to continue doing it. And just anyone who wants to join and if they're blessed by it, then we'll just keep going.
Thank you so much, Pastor Tim, for your willingness to serve.
It's my pleasure, brothers. Now, unfortunately, next week, as I mentioned to you, each month I have an elder meeting at this time. And next week is my elder meeting, and I was not able to find my other, the rest of my week is also booked up. So I'm going to have to postpone next week. So we will not be meeting until 2 weeks from this morning on June 12th for you guys, I think it is. Friday morning, June 12th. So I apologize. I could not find another time that would work for next week. So that will give you some time to review your structural diagram, right? Yes. I know you've been waiting for this.
Yes.
This moment. So please take a moment to examine, go back to the syllabus from Module 1, and in Canvas, you can go there and download it if you don't have it, and review the pages there on structural diagramming. I think it's pages 15 to 17, and just try to do it for Psalm 99, okay? And then next time we gather together, we're going to do, Lord willing, the structural diagram, the textual observations, and just complete the process. These are steps you've already done. They're not new steps like for poetic analysis, so hopefully that will go a little quicker. But yeah, again, I apologize. I won't be able to lead a meeting for next Friday morning, but the one following will pick up again on June 12th. Okay?
Okay. Thank you, Pastor Tim.
Thank you.
All right. Can I ask Emmanuel, would you please close us in prayer? Just ask the Lord to bless us as we depart.
Yes, let's pray. Lord, we thank you, Lord, for this wonderful time and opportunity.
Yes, Lord. Thank you so much,
Thank you,
Lord,
Lord,
for gathering us,
you
Lord.
have given us, Lord,
Lord,
learn
to,
today
to learn, Lord, about the Psalm, Lord. Thank you for
how for
Pastor
the
Tim,
knowledge and
Lord,
wisdom, Lord.
for
We will
her
continue to harbor, Lord.
service, for your servant
We
heart,
thank you,
Lord,
Lord, for
to us,
giving
Lord,
us the
unable,
teacher,
Lord, to
Lord,
help
who is
us, O God, Lord.
compassionate and kind, O God.
Amen,
Lord,
Lord.
guide us, O Lord, and bless us as we separate our ways. And meet us, Lord, another day, Lord. Keep us safe from any harm.
Yes,
And lead
Lord.
us your way as we go on our way, Lord. We hope that you will continue to guide us and help us, Lord, to be the student.
Amen.
Lord,
Amen, Lord.
bless us, O Lord, with your mercy and wisdom. We thank you for everything, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen.
You